Neil, thanks for joining me on such short notice. We're kind of responding to a video that a Catholic apologist, Trent Horn, has put out recently, reacting to David Snell about the plates, the Book of Mormon plates, not being able to hold the actual words of the Book of Mormon. And this has been quite a back and forth thing. And so we had this 20-minute video from Trent Horn yesterday. And well, Neil, what did you think of it? Like, was he correct in all in what he was saying? What was he incorrect on? I mean, could the plates fit the text of the Book of Mormon?
Well, the short answer is yes. The plates could have fit the text of the Book of Mormon. It's hard to say what he was correct on because one of the challenges, and something I just kind of want to express up front here, is we have to make so many assumptions when we try to do something like this, when we try to answer a question like this, because we don't have the plates in front of us, right? We'd all love to have them and be able to examine them and have them metallurgically tested and be able to look at the script on them and understand how that script and language relates to the translation that we have. But we don't have that, right? And so there are a lot of, we have what the witnesses said and what they described, how they described the artifact that they saw and handled and things like that. But that only gives us so much information. We have to fill in a lot of blanks, and we've got to, there's a lot of variables at play. And if you want to, you can choose a set of variables that make it impossible to fit the plates, the Book of Mormon text on the plates. And when you do that, it makes it really easy to make the whole thing look really ridiculous. And Trent Horn's not the first one to do this. There are other critics, ex-Mormons and things like that, who have been doing this for a while. And he doesn't say this. I don't know this for sure, but based on some of the talking points he hit on, it seems like he's borrowing his arguments from others who have made, ex-Mormon websites and stuff that have made these arguments before. But there are a lot of variables at play, and he's not, I didn't feel like Trent was really transparent about how he landed on the specific variables that he did in a few instances. I'm not sure he even knows himself in some cases where the variables lie. So, and the biggest question mark that we really cannot get an answer to is how the English text relates to the original text of the translation. And I'm not just talking about like expansion theory and stuff, which he critiqued in his video. It's just a plain fact that translations differ. Different kinds of translations exist, and they differ in their relationship to a source text or an original text that's being translated. And translators will vary in how they approach certain things, and that can change kind of the relationship and how much space is required for an original text, depending on how that relationship with the translated text fits. If that makes sense. Basically, you have a range of translation options, from really tight, really literal word for word kind of attempted translation. You can't ever have a purely word for word translation, but you can try to be really close to that. Or you can have a looser, more paraphrastic translation, and you can even have expansive translations. Those all exist. Examples of things like that could be given, but without the actual source text, we can't say what that relationship is between the English text and the source text. And so we're kind of taking some stabs in the dark when we try to figure something like this out. Like, how much space does it really require to figure out to put the plates together, or to get the Book of Mormon to fit on the plates? So with those kind of variables in mind, like I said, you can just plug in numbers if you want to, and you can make it not fit, or you can make it fit. The question is, how reasonable are your assumptions and the numbers you're plugging in, and what's your basis for them, right? And like I said, Trent's not totally transparent on some of those things. He has repeatedly insisted that there could only be 40 plates available to fit the Book of Mormon text, but he's never said where or how he determined that number. Now, my guess, and I don't know, I'm just having to take a guess, but my guess is he got that from an old Improvement Era article published in 1966 by Reed Putnam. This was the first person to propose that the plates were made out of Tumbaga, And so, and he, in his article, what he did is he just assumed certain dimensions. He didn't argue or reason for them. He didn't explain how he came to those conclusions. He assumed certain dimensions that weren't stated by the witnesses. So he assumed that each plate was, and we're going to be dealing with some razor thin numbers here. I'll try to give, as an American, I like to use inches, but given how small these are, the metric system is actually a little more effective in giving some of these measurements. But he assumed that each plate was, this is Putnam. Putnam assumed each plate was 0.02 inches thick,
wow.
which I believe is, let's see if I have that in millimeters here. I think that might be half a millimeter, basically half a millimeter thick.
Wow.
Yeah. And what we're actually going to come to is that that's actually a pretty thick estimate for the plates. They could be much thinner. But he assumed, half a millimeter thick plates. And he assumed that there was 50% airspace or void space between each plate, right? So you stack them up and it's not like a solid block of metal. There's little imperfections in how the plates have been made that allow airspace in between. And he assumed that 50% of the stack would be that void space or airspace. And so that's kind of how he came to his calculations. And he reasoned that there would be about 20 plates per inch. And if you have a 6-inch stack and you have 20 plates per inch and you have 2/3 sealed, then you only have 40 plates available. So that's, like I said, I think that's where Trent gets his 40 plate number. I don't know for sure. The problem is, like I said, that's loaded with a series of assumptions, and there are some variables here that need to be considered. Others have come up with other estimates. So in the 1980s, a guy named Robert F. Smith, he used a range of thickness for each plate. He argued that they could have been thinner, as thin as 0.15 inches. And if you assume that, then you can get as many as 200 total plates in a 6-inch stack. And then you have maybe 67 unsealed plates if 2/3 are sealed. And you can get even thinner. And we're actually going to get into that. In fact, I guess we could, both Smith and Putnam are just making kind of arbitrary guesses. They're just saying, hey, maybe they were this thin. Maybe they were this thin. But others have looked more closely at what the witnesses have actually said. The witnesses, of course, didn't give us an exact measurement of thickness. They were only seeing and handling, and then they had to make estimates based on what they saw and handled. They didn't have like a ruler or, with highly technical and accurate measurements on there down to the fraction of an inch. So they're kind of making guesses themselves, the witnesses. But one of the things the witnesses frequently compared the plates to. Martin Harris did this. David Whitmer did this. I think Oliver Cowdery did, off the top of my head. I'm not sure. Joseph Smith said this. But common tin was a frequent comparison. They said they were about the thickness of common tin or a little thinner. Not quite the thickness of common tin is what Joseph Smith said. Right. Now, tin thickness could vary depending on what gauge of sheet metal you're getting, right? But the thickness that was considered common in the 19th century, it was literally designated with the letter C for common, was either gauge 29 or gauge 30 thickness, which comes out to about 0.012 or 0.0135 inches, which is about 1/3 of a millimeter. That's how thin we're talking. 3/10 to 1/3 of a millimeter. Another comparison that was made by Samuel Smith, one of the 8 witnesses. We have a letter from William McClellan who says, I heard Samuel Smith preaching, and this is what he said about the plates. And he compared them to thin pasteboard. Like tin, pasteboard could vary in thickness depending on what stock you were getting or whatever. But thin pasteboard might be compared to like playing cards. Playing cards in the 19th century were made of pasteboard and things like that. I have a friend, Jerry Grover, who's actually done a lot of research on the plates. We're going to talk about him a little bit more here. But he actually bought 19th century playing cards and had them and measured them and found them to be about the same thickness as the tin, between 0.011 and 0.012 inches. So that's, again, about 0.3 of a millimeter, a little thinner, perhaps even. And then witnesses like David Whitmer and Emma, on occasion. David Whitmer once said that they were like thick parchment. Emma Smith said she felt them through the cloth, and she said that they were pliable. She was able to thumb the edges, and they made a metallic rustling sound, and she compared them to thick paper. Now, paper in the 19th century could vary quite a bit in thickness. So what's thick paper? I don't know, depending on what her frame of reference was. But the average thickness of paper in the 19th century it's very, very thin. 0.005 to 0.0067 inches, or basically 1/8 of an inch to a little less than 0.2 of an inch, 0.13 to 0.17 millimeters, or did I say an inch? 1/8 of a millimeter to less than 0.2 of a millimeter. But
wow.
So yeah, it could, the plates, based on what the witnesses said, if we're going to take their statement seriously, suggest very, very thin plates. There are actually some metallurgists who've run some tests in the process. David Baird is a metallurgist who he wanted to make a replica set of the plates. He didn't make them out of actual gold or tumbaga. Because that's really expensive. But he did make them. He wanted to run some tests to maybe get an assessment on, okay, if they're gonna be thin enough to thumb the edge, like Emma said and stuff, how thin do they have to be to do that and rustle and things like that. He did it with brass. He tested brass and found that a range between 0.01 to 0.015 inches. So that's about 1/4 of a millimeter to about 0.4 of a millimeter. With brass, was able to make that rustling sound. Jerry Grover, who I mentioned earlier, he's done a lot of research on the plates. He tested just straight copper plates and found that they were able to do that he had thinner dimensions that he tested. So he tested from between 0.004 to 0.01 inches. That's basically 1/10 of a millimeter to 1/4 of a millimeter. With tumbaga, Grover tested one tumbaga sheet that was about 0.2 of a millimeter thick. To see if it had that kind of the right kind of flexibility and stuff, and he found that it did. So altogether, if we're going to take the witnesses' statements seriously, we're talking about plates that are between maybe 0.005 to 0.015 inches. And that's going to be, again, about 1/8 of a millimeter to a little less than 0.4 of a millimeter, 0.38 millimeters in thickness. Very, very thin. And now a question that some people might ask at this stage is, could ancient people actually make plates that thin? Is that technology that would have been available? And the answer is yes, it is. And I'll just cite through a few examples. I have documented these in a paper that's hopefully publishing soon. I presented it last year at the Fair Defending the Book of Mormon conference, the 2023 September virtual conference that they held. You can find it on their YouTube page if you want to see some of my documentation. I've got a few sources, a few examples here that weren't in that original paper, but they'll be in the published version, which is just.
I will link your video on here on the video and in the description if people are interested.
Yeah, that'd be great. The published version is currently a 60-page paper with like almost 250 footnotes. So I've got the documentation for all of this very thoroughly, but we're trying to kind of go through this pretty quickly. But in Nariño, Colombia, there were tumbaga sheets and discs that were discovered, dated to between 600 and 1200 AD, that had decorative designs and things etched onto the surface. And they were between 1/3 of a millimeter and a little more than 1/2 of a millimeter thick, 0.33 to 0.53 millimeters. That's 0.013 to 0.012 inches, right within the range of common tin in 19th century times, for what it's worth. There was a tumbaga bead that was found at Altun Ha, Belize, in the 1970s. It was between 0.3 and 0.4 of a millimeter thick. Again, that's right in line with the thickness of tin in Joseph Smith's day. And it was dated to the 400s AD. I think the study actually just vaguely said before 500 AD. So 400s AD, though, this is literally an artifact that dates to the time of Moroni and when he's burying the plates.
Yeah.
The one that really kind of impresses me is this. It's this ornamental headdress that was found in the south central Andes of Peru. It's described as gold, but its alloy was never tested. So whether it's got a copper alloy or not, we don't know. And this is a common problem. Is a lot of gold work that's discovered in the Americas is just never metallurgically tested to see if it's Tumbaga alloy or just pure gold. But it's just described as gold. It might be a gold copper alloy. We don't know. But it's also 0.3 to 0.4 of a millimeter. And what is actually really interesting to me about this one is it has designs etched on both sides. And so this is a really thin sheet, and you are able to engrave on both sides of this artifact without it pushing through to the other side. So if you're wondering, could they do that with something this thin, like the witnesses described the plates being engraved on both sides? The answer is yes, they could. And this artifact, it dates right to between 200 BC and AD 400. So it's right within Book of Mormon times. A later example is a Mixtec mask that is 1/10 of a millimeter thick. Again, this is another one it's described as gold. I think it probably is pretty pure gold because it has, it's engraved and the engraving pushes through to the other side. And gold is just really soft. It'd be really hard to engrave pure gold that's really thin on both sides without the engraving pushing through. But this is probably pure gold, but it's 1/10 of a millimeter thick. And it's actually got, it's a mask, and so it's got a face engraved on it. And then on the eyelids of the face, it's got a glyph that represents the word gold on it. So it has a little bit of writing on it, not a lot, but it does have engraving on it that tells us they were working with this kind of thin material. According to a metallurgist, or an archaeometallurgist, I guess is maybe what he really is. That's just a metallurgist who studies ancient artifacts, right? His name's Warwick Bray. He said that Peruvian metal workers were able to make sheets of Tumbaga as thin as 0.2 of a millimeter, and to do it consistently, so it was an even thickness and things like that. How far back does this go? We've got an example from Ecuador that's it's unclear to me from the article, and I'll admit part of the issue is a language barrier. The article's in Spanish, and I'm not super conversant in Spanish, so but it's unclear to me whether it's a gold or a Tumbaga artifact. But it's only 1/10 of a millimeter thick at its thickest point, very, very thin, and it dates to between 915 and 780 BC. So wow. They were making really thin sheet metal artifacts well into Book of Mormon times, well back to Book of Mormon times, and in the Americas, and could do this pretty consistently with different with either pure gold or Tumbaga alloys. That they were able to do this kind of stuff. And again, some questions that might come up for people is, well, could you engrave both sides? Jerry Grover, who I mentioned before, ran some tests with copper sheet metal as thin as 0.005 inches. That's again about 1/8 of a millimeter thick. He was able to engrave both sides of a copper sheet like that without it pushing through. I myself, Jerry Grover, actually just recently, this was like last week, he brought over a couple of sheets of copper that had been electroplated with gold. Not really a Tumbaga alloy, but he's trying to kind of replicate that the best he can without having to pay money to make Tumbaga. But Jerry, he brought over this copper sheet that was 0.0067 inches thick with an electroplating of gold over top of it. And that's 0.17 millimeters, so very, very thin. And he let me handle it. I was able to see that despite how thin it was very firm. It held its shape just fine. I'm not a metallurgist, so I'm not going to try to use any of the big terms he used, but he basically said this was made to the specs, that the copper plate was made to the specs of actual ancient copper. So this is something that ancient people could have made. And it was he let me engrave on it using like a little obsidian tool that they could have
Oh,
used
nice.
in ancient times, and it was very, very easy. The
Right.
gold layer on top is so soft. It was very, very easy to engrave and scratch in characters and letters, and to do very small ones at that. And it didn't even scratch into the copper. It wasn't necessary to do so, and so you could easily do it on both sides without making a dent. So it's absolutely possible for the plates to have been very, very thin. Now,
Family
whether
home
they were or
evening in
not,
the Rappleye household sounds awesome, by
that,
the way.
that's right. My point being, based on like even my own hands-on experience, I'm pretty confident the plates could have been very thin potentially. The thinner you make those plates, the more plates you're allowed to have, and so that's a variable Trent Horn doesn't really take into account or try to deal with in his analysis. Jerry Grover, he wrote a book in 2015 where a lot of this research I'm talking about came from. He wrote a book that it's kind of a funny title. What is the title exactly? I better just double check before I say
Yeah,
it.
that's fine.
It's called Ziff Magic Goggles and Golden Plates. So, and it's available free online. He puts all of his research available free online. He's a geologist and an engineer. He does a lot more of the sciencey stuff with the plates. And he basically, he did all the math to put together a mathematical model for what the plates could have been like. He kind of concluded that the plates could have been as thin as 0.5 to 0.01 inches, and that based on that, there could have been between 300 and 600 total plates in the 6-inch stack. Now, how many does that leave us based on how much is sealed? That's another variable that I think is important to keep in mind. Trent Horn simply uses the 2/3 sealed number, and we do hear that number thrown around often, but it is important, I think, to recognize that witness testimony is varied a little bit on this. We have, to my knowledge, and there may be sources I missed, but I've combed through the witnesses' sources here pretty thoroughly. To my knowledge, we have two sources that say it was 2/3 sealed. One is Orson Pratt, who himself isn't actually one of the witnesses. He's presumably relaying information he heard from Joseph Smith or one of the witnesses, but he said they were 2/3 sealed in 1856. And then David Whitmer, in an interview in 1881, said that they were 2/3 sealed. But on another occasion, David Whitmer said that only 1/2 was sealed. That was in an interview in 1878. There's an earlier source attributed to one of the Whitmer witnesses. So it's a newspaper report from 1831, and it doesn't say which Whitmer brother gave him this information. But it basically says that the sealed and unsealed portion were equidistant from to each other or something like that. And I take equidistant to mean that this particular witness perceived the sealed portion and the unsealed portion to be about the same size, right? So 50-50 split. And then you actually have a couple of sources that completely invert the 2/3 number. So they give us 1/3 sealed. And oddly enough, one of these sources is Orson Pratt. In a newspaper report, it's actually, I think, the Catholic Telegraph that reports this. He gives a sermon in 1832, and the newspaper reporter says that 2/3 of the plates were translated, and so only 1/3 was sealed.
Right.
And that's what he says that Orson Pratt said. And then there's also George Q. Cannon in the year 1900, who also says that only 1/3 was sealed. Now, that leaves us with like I said, some variables here. How did we get some of these different sources? Well, I assume that somewhere along the lines with like the 2/3, 1/3 thing, someone's getting confused about which ratio is sealed and unsealed. But our sources aren't such that we can really definitively say which one's which. Like, did they get confused? Was it 2/3 sealed and then they got confused and thought it was 2/3 open? Or was it 1/3 sealed and they got confused and thought it was 2/3 sealed. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We can't really say with the sources that we have for sure which way it goes. And then, you have these sources that say only 1/2 was sealed, which I kind of basically, if you want my 2 cents on this,
Of course, Neal.
I think what we have to understand is, again, these witnesses are eyeballing what they see. And so if we understand that, if we assume that maybe, say, 60% of the plates were sealed, you can understand how witnesses eyeballing that, some might look at that and be like, looks about 2/3 are sealed. While others might look at that and say, looks like about half was sealed, right? If it was like 60% that was sealed. Or if it was 40% that was sealed, you can see how some witnesses might look at it and say, looks like about 1/3 that's sealed. And another might kind of look at it and be like, looks like it's about a half that's sealed. So, I would kind of assume that the range for the sealed and unsealed portion is maybe between 40 and 60%, depending on whether you trust the 1/3 or the 2/3 more. But to be comprehensive, we have to consider the possibility that it's between 1/3 and 2/3 sealed. Those are our variables, right? And so the moment we start considering some of these other variables, again, our number of plates, we have to start considering a range of potentially available plates, right? So we have, on the one hand, if we were to assume the numbers that Trent Horn is assuming, which again is based off of Reed Putnam, and I'll toss those numbers in there as part of the potential range here. Then there's between 100, the numbers that Trent Horn's using would suggest 120 total plates. If there's 2/3 sealed, then 40 plates is what's available. But if there's only 1/3 sealed, then there's 80 plates that are available on that setting. But our upper bound, based on Jerry Grover's work, would be around 600 plates, right? And that gives us a ton more room to work with potentially, right? Even if 2/3 of that are sealed, we still have 200 plates. If only 1/3 is sealed, we have up to 400 plates here to work with. So it creates a very wide range when we consider all these different possibilities. We maybe have between 40 to 400 plates to work with, right?
Yeah.
And that's literally an order of magnitude difference, right? And it completely changes the calculus we're dealing with when we're saying can we really fit all of the text on the Book of Mormon plates. Now, I think we've probably I don't know, have we already been going for 20 minutes?
Yes, but this has been exciting. This has been great.
I mean, what I really want to get at is, I don't remember the exact numbers Trent gives, but he looks at 2 examples from the ancient world where he calculates kind of the number of English words per square inch they produce through translation. And he's like, man, this is so low. There's no way, you've got to have over 80 words per square inch to fit the whole Book of Mormon onto 40 plates, right? But those 2 samples that he gives, he's making kind of a sweeping generalization from just those 2 examples. They're not representative of what was really possible to achieve in ancient metal inscriptions. And this is something I went through in my presentation very thoroughly. I have a couple of examples that I've discovered since I gave that presentation, which will be in the published form. But taking his numbers at face value as far as needing 80 words per square inch if we're going to get onto 40. And actually, I don't think that something that I'm going to make the case harder here for us in a minute here, because I don't think Trent Horn actually factors in the lost 116 pages, right? So
yeah.
That, from the 270,000 words that he estimates for the whole Book of Mormon, my estimate is a little lower, and it's based on Royal Skousen's work, but only by about 500 words. So it doesn't make a huge difference. But you've got to add in another almost 65 or 64,000 words for the last 160 pages. And I give more precise numbers in my paper on this stuff. So my total word count that I'm trying to account for when I say, hey, can we fit the Book of Mormon on the plates, is actually over 333,000, almost 334,000, 334,000 words. which if we wanted to get onto the minimum 40 plates is about 87 English translated words per square inch. If we wanted to get it onto the 400 plates, we only need 8.7 translated words per square inch, right?
Okay.
So what's actually possible in the ancient world? And again, this is I say what's possible because this is all we can really do. We don't. I just can't stress enough. We don't know the relationship of our English text to the Reformed Egyptian text that was on the plates. So we can just look at some ancient examples and kind of make some approximations or reasonable inferences from that as far as what's possible. So the densest, the most dense, I should say, maybe, I don't know, example that I have found to date is actually a gold engraved amulet written in Mandaic, which is a Northwest Semitic language. It's a branch of Aramaic. So that's the same language family that Hebrew's in, to just give you some context there. The amulet is 1.2 inches square. It's very, very small. It's actually in the British Museum, and it has 52 lines of text front and back. So that's 26 lines on each side. The characters, as far as I could determine, had to be about 1.5 millimeters tall. 26 lines, and the length of the amulet is about 41 millimeters. So just doing the math, that gives you about 1.6 millimeters per line. So assuming a little bit of space in each line and stuff, we're talking about no bigger than maybe 1.5 millimeters for the characters on this amulet.
Wow.
Again, 1.2 inches squared, so a little more than a 1 inch square. The front side has 102 words on it. The back side has 127 words on it. So, and that's the English translation of the words. So average translated words per square inch on this particular artifact is about 95 words per square inch. When you average it out to that, it's well, like 94.9 to be more precise. And by my math, you could fit the whole Book of Mormon, and I'm including the lost 116 pages in that, onto 37 plates if it was written at that level of density.
Wow.
So I don't, and personally, I think there were more than 40 plates. But if you really want to insist we've only got 40 plates, I can work with that. We've got at least one example, and I'll admit it's an outlier. I'm not claiming this is representative at all. It's an outlier for sure, but we have at least one example that does show us it hypothetically at least could be done to write at that level of density in an ancient Near Eastern language closely related to Hebrew. On the other end of the spectrum, closer to our 400 plate maximum, you've got a bronze inscription that was found at the Temple of Dendera. It's written in Demotic, which is an Egyptian script. Might have been the script that Nephi was starting with, though we know the Nephites' script evolved. I personally think he was starting with hieratic rather than Demotic, but it could have been Demotic. That was available in 600 BC. So it's inscribed on bronze. Like I said, it's a pretty long inscription. There's a lot of damage to it, so it's hard to say exactly how many words it would have come out to, but my estimate based on the surviving translation is about 1,570 words, maybe. The surface area is pretty large. It's about 21 by 9 inches. Those again are general estimates. I give more accurate numbers in my paper, more precise numbers, I should say. But by my math, this comes out to about 9.1 translated words per square inch, which if you wrote the Book of Mormon in this at that rate, you would need about 383 plates to get the whole Book of Mormon on there. And again, I'm including the last 116 pages there. And these, this is the other end of the extreme, right? Close to the 400 maximum that we hypothesized could have been available. But I think it's important to note that these characters are actually pretty large compared to the ones I was talking about. Those Mandaic characters, 1.5 millimeters. These Demotic characters are about 8.7 millimeters in size. And so almost 9 millimeters. They're actually the largest writing sample, largest character size of all the inscriptions I looked at. So theoretically, if you wrote that Demotic a little smaller, right, you shrink that size down a bit, you could again maximize that plate space a lot more. A few other examples. I mean, I could give a ton of examples. I looked at a total of 21 examples of this sort of thing. I guess maybe we can just summarize the average stuff from there. I mean, several of them, you know, I gave you two things from each extreme end, but there's a bunch of examples that I have that come in around like, you know, 200 plates is what it would come out to, or, you know, or 75 plates or whatever, right? So there's examples that give us numbers all along that spectrum of what's possible. But the average, if you take the total, the 21 inscriptions that I looked at, and all of the inscriptions I looked at are written on metal. None of them are like papyrus or other materials. This is, I'm trying to understand what was possible writing on metal. So I only used metallic inscriptions. I looked at 21 total inscriptions. The character sizes ranged from, not counting that Demotic one I mentioned where the characters were like 8.7 millimeters. All the rest of the examples I looked at, the characters were between 1 and 6 millimeters. So they got very, very small. They got down to 1 millimeter a character. You know, kind of on the upper bound, they were about 6 millimeters. A lot of them were more around the 3 to 4 millimeter range was pretty common.
Okay.
I looked at examples in Demotic Egyptian, like I said, Hebrew, Aramaic, Mandaic, which I mentioned earlier, Akkadian, Hittite, and Greek. And some of those are more closely related to languages that are in the Book of Mormon than others. And in fact, the ones that tended to be more compact were the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Mandaic. The Demotic, I think, would have been more compact if they wrote it smaller. The Akkadian and Hittite and Greek are less closely related to Book of Mormon languages, and they were generally, on average, less compact than those, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Mandaic. But the overall average was 31.7 translated words per square inch. And at that average, you'd need about 110 plates to fit the entire Book of Mormon, including the lost 116 pages. And you know what? I'm comfortable with that. I could work with 110 plates. That means, you know, depending on what you assume, if you assume 2/3 are sealed, we're maybe talking about, again, considering they're eyeballing it, we don't have to be super exact. If there's maybe 300 plates total, right? We could maybe have around 100 plates, 110 plates free to put the translation on. You know, that works. Or let's just say it's only 50% sealed. You really only need a total stack of about 200 plates then, right? And you have maybe 100, give or take, loose plates. 110 is what you need to fit the whole text of the Book of Mormon. Again, I feel pretty comfortable with those numbers. I think that's all very possible, based on what I've already discussed about how thin the plates could have been, and about the size that people could write and things like that. I'm pretty satisfied with the data that we can pretty rationally fit. I'll tell you what, again, the extremes are from 40 to 400 are out there, but I would narrow that range quite a bit. Let's say between 70 and 130 plates, right? With 100 being your average. I feel pretty comfortable that the Book of Mormon could have fit on something like that.
That is brilliant. I mean, what a response. And considering too, when you think of all of that, and you also consider some of the sources that you have cited and the other examples to compare it to were made with the intent to be decorative, or, you know, something similar to that. Whereas the Book of Mormon, the intent was sort of a desperate abridgment. You know, the intent was to fit as much in as possible and condense as much as possible. And so even with the worst case scenario, it seems like the evidence shows that it's quite reasonable to think of, which makes it all the more confusing. And I think Trent's argument on that video was kind of weak, if I dare say that, and perhaps below the usual standard that I would think Trent would go to. And I think what added to that was that he kind of shoehorned the Book of Abraham in there as a kind of I'm just going to put this in there to kind of add a salt into the wound or something. He shared a clip from a BYU professor about it. So yeah, it was kind of, I don't know, it seemed quite bashful. It seemed like it was less rigorous scholarship and more, I want to get back at this video that I didn't like, which seems kind of a little bit petty and tribal. And I don't know why there is tribalism involved, because I mean, I have no issue with Catholics. I host many of them on my podcast. I don't know why he's enamored by the Latter-day Saint combating at the moment.
Yeah, and to your point about the Book of Mormon authors were really trying to cram as much as they could and to maximize their space. I didn't mention this, but I meant to mention earlier that the witnesses described the plates as covered or filled are the words they frequently use when they describe. They say each plate was covered or filled, and they describe the characters most frequently as either small or fine. And so their observation, and those aren't necessarily measurable dimensions. Perception of small or fine writing is kind of subjective. But their perception was that the writing was small and they were filling each plate, both sides, right? And so, yeah, the witness testimony tells us they were maximizing that space, and that's why when I went to test this, I was looking for examples of metal writing that looked to me like they had written in small, fine script, and they were filling their surface area quite extensively, right? And so, and that's why I say, like, the two examples that Trent Horn chose to use, they're not representative of what's actually possible. And again, with all the variables and question marks we have about how it really worked, we can only look at what's actually possible, right? We can't prove that one set of variables over another is actually more likely. And so, yeah, like I said, I feel pretty comfortable based on my own research, based on the data I've looked at and analyzed with my own eyes, with my own mind, that the Book of Mormon could have fit on the space that was available in the plates as described by the witnesses.
Well, being a fan of your work and reading many of your things, Neal, I'm also comfortable based on your research. So that's good. And I appreciate you coming on. And I think we can comfortably say that Trent Horn, you are wrong in this. And I'm grateful that you would spend some time. Again, this is just to build faith. We're not doing a bashful attack or anything. I feel like we have far more in common with Trent and Catholics and people of all faiths than we do different. And so I've always opted for, I don't know, strengthening those bonds rather than kind of strange attacks. So I appreciate you, Neal.
Yeah, no problem. And I think we haven't really even said anything about the Catholic faith, right? We're not here to try and bash that or attack that. We're just trying to defend what we believe, right? And I would encourage Trent to spend more time and to get back to defending his faith as a Catholic. You don't need to prove that the Book of Mormon couldn't fit on the gold plates to be a Catholic or to defend the Catholic faith. So I think your time is better spent trying to build up your own faith and your own faith community. Is kind of my opinion. I don't spend any time actually publicly attacking other religions and faiths. I'm just trying to build up my own. So and my own religious community, and that's what I would hope people of all faiths would be doing. So
absolutely. Well, thank you, Neal, and I'll let you get back to your day.
All right. Thank you, Ben.
See you later.
Okay. See ya.